Some of the most interesting builds that I come across tend to fall in my lap, and that is the story that we have here. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with my 1/4 scale Browning M1917 water-cooled MG. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. This model here, being 1/4 scale, is a bit outside of my normal working purview. However, if anyone is interested in the scales that I do offer commission build services in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is a bit of a unique one. It did start off as a kit, however, I went ahead and deviated from the kit components in order to enhance it and to improve the model further in order to get to the condition that we see here. In this video, we're going to be going ahead, giving the model a thorough in-box review, as well as going over the various upgrades that were added to the piece to bring it up to the condition that you see here. With that in mind, there's going to be a bit of info coming right at you, so just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this model here is the Browning M1917 water-cooled heavy 30 cal MG. This weapon here was designed by the one, the only, and most certainly the most talented John Moses Browning. This is one of his most iconic weapon designs, which is saying a lot considering that this is the guy that brought us the 1911, the BAR, the 1919, and the M250 cal. This was Browning's second foray into a belt-fed MG. His first go-ahead was in the end of the 19th century in 1895 with the potato digger. That weapon was an interesting weapon in its own right and should be the topic of its own video, but long story short, that was a gas-operated belt-fed MG chambered in 30 cal, or specifically the 30-06 cartridge when it was adopted for the US military. That weapon saw service with the US military until the World War I time frame, where in about 1916 or so, the weapon was really starting to show its age, and a replacement was definitely going to be necessary, specifically since the writing was on the wall that at some point or another, the US was going to be entering into World War I. Fortunately, the US military didn't have to wait long for a replacement home-designed MG because in the 1910s time frame, Browning decided to go ahead and design a brand new machine gun using the lessons that he learned from the potato digger. The main difference was with the operating system. Rather than having a gas system like on the previous design, this one here was going to utilize a recoil operated system. Also, unlike the previous system, which was air cooled, this unit here was going to be water cooled, which was something that was current technology of the period and was utilized with great effect with the many MGs designed by Maxim. The Maxim concept of utilizing a water-cooled jacket around the barrel was a fantastic idea in order to keep up sustained fire and to prevent the barrels from overheating. This was basically the de facto way MGs were being implemented at this time, and remember, this is supposed to be a heavy machine gun, which is intended for use for static type fortifications. Because of that, you're not going to need to move around this thing, and you need to be able to output a heavy volume of fire. In this type of situation here, the water-cooled jacket is definitely one that ticks all the right boxes. The unit was also paired with excellent sights, as well as also an equally excellent mount. With the way the mount is designed, you have very precise ways to elevate and depress the MG, as well as also give it some limited transverse with just the rotating of some knobs. Because of this design, you can fine-tune this thing to have a nice little beaten path where you have your cone of fire being focused in one location. For a static war like World War I, something like this is definitely very effective. During the 1910s time frame, more R&D was done on the design to make sure that it was as reliable and was ready for mass production as possible. This was completed in the year 1917, thus the name M1917. Even though the weapon system was ready, only a small number of them saw service with the US military on the Western Front. The majority of the arms that were being used by the military for their MGs were Allied in origin, either being French or British designs. The war ended before the unit was really able to see mass usage by the military. The unit stayed in inventory as well as in US service up until World War II, where then this thing really came into its own, production ramped up, and this unit was heavily utilized by the American forces during the duration of that war on both the Pacific and on the European theaters. Even though the role of a bell-fed 30 cal tripod-mounted MG was being fulfilled by a lighter brother, being the air-cooled Browning 1919, the one area where the 1917 was still very relevant was with its ability to keep up sustained fire. This is why the system, even though it was beginning to show its age, was still just as relevant during the World War II timeframe as it was in the years that even followed it. The unit kept on seeing service throughout the Korean War, and it wasn't until the late 1950s was when this system began to be retired with the then new M60 GPMG. Although this unit was officially retired and phased out, there was still a large number of them left on inventory, and many of them wound up being issued out as military aid for Allied countries. Some of them went to South Vietnam, and several stayed in U.S. inventory and being used at Fort Benning for the low crawl area, where you would have live rounds flying over the top of your head. And one of these units here probably did a really good job at that. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/4 scale Browning M1917 kit from Verlinden Productions. This is literally a model that I had no idea I was going to be ever building. This was also a build that quite literally fell into my lap. The model that we have here was a very, very recent addition to the stash, and it's one that was actually gifted to me by a very generous viewer out there who loves the channel and decided to just basically give me a bunch of stuff. And if that's you, you are very, very generous. You are a star, and my eternal thanks is definitely off to you. So, in his honor, I decided to bump this one up to the front of the line and go ahead and give it a proper build and model showcase video that you're watching. As for the background of this model over here, honestly, I don't really know. Now, I know about Verlinden Productions. I am well versed in that. Verlinden Productions is a company that is essentially the first aftermarket parts company for military miniatures, specifically in 1/35 scale. It was started by the Belgian modeler Francois Verlinden, or Verlinden as my father always called it, and it just stuck with me. And the individual in question was a excellent, fantastic modeler. He is actually up there with Chapin as one of the OGs in elevating the art of plastic miniature models. Where before these individuals came onto the scene, plastic models were more or less intended for kids. They were more of a plaything. But these individuals here took the plastic kits on the market and turned them into art. And in addition to that, Verlinden was able to see some shortcomings with a lot of kits out there and also some gaps in the market, and was able to produce aftermarket detail components in order to upgrade these models. And this is dating back now to the early 1980s. Way, way ahead of its time. And to add upon that, Verlinden was utilizing cast resin and even photo etch components to do so. So again, he is basically credited as being one of the founders of the aftermarket scene. In addition to all of that, Verlinden was a very prolific modeler. He built a ton of models, and he wrote a countless amount of books on tutorials and on steps on what to do, how to improve your models. He was an excellent diorama maker, and his books, matter of fact, one of the books my father has in the collection is what I used to thumb through when I was a youngster and stumbling into this stuff. And he was a huge influence on a lot of modelers out there, and basically, again, he was the ground floor on many of the modelers to come, and in fact, many of the artists today can trace back to what they are doing, to what Verlinden was pioneering back in the 80s. So, I have a lot of respect for the man. Verlinden himself was a Belgian-born modeler. He eventually, I believe, moved to the United States out in Nevada, if I'm not mistaken. And while there, he ran his company, Verlinden Productions. He was in business for many, many years, about 30 to be exact, releasing a wide range of stuff from miniature submarines to artillery pieces in different scales from 135 to 116. We have a quarter scale unit over here. He actually had a range of quarter scale weapons, which was kind of cool. Again, this was before the 1/6 scale action figures really took off. So he was really an interesting fellow in the type of stuff that he would release. He was also a very prolific figure releaser as well. A lot of resin custom figures he would release, and everything was really more or less geared for diorama usage, and that was really his bread and butter. Verlinden production parts were very, very prolific. I've seen them in countless hobby shops, and a lot of vendors would sell them at model shows, and you would see these boxes basically everywhere. So the guy had a very good run. Unfortunately, about 10 years ago or so, he was getting up there in age and he decided to retire. And when he did, the business was sold off to, I believe, another person. Don't really know offhand. I think it was honestly the guy who runs Field of Armor, if I'm not mistaken. And after that, Verlinden Productions, as we know it, is completely gone. So a lot of the products that are out there are just vestigial, floating around on the market. And it's, again, one of those Highlander type situations where every one that gets built is now one less in circulation. And that's going to be the story with this one over here. Also, it's important to point out that many of the items that Verlinden did produce, specifically his full kits, eventually the market did catch up. He did release a V100 armored car in 116, which was cool, and I think also in 135. Not so much in 116, but in 135th scale, that also caught up, and a lot of the artillery pieces caught up as well. But for a while, he was like the de facto supplier of a lot of these components, and again, I have a lot of respect for the guy. So this here is a 1/4 scale model of the Browning M1917 water-cooled MG. I would usually say in these videos when the kits were originally released, but unfortunately, I really have no idea in this case. I tried to do some research online, and I got nothing on an actual release date. What I do know is that these things were, this particular kit here, the quarter scale 1917, was released in 2 batches. The original release and the re-release. And the one we have here is from the re-release, and that is due to the item number that we have here on the box. The item number in question is 2601, and this is for the ones produced on the re-release. As for the original, there is a item number for that. I don't know offhand. I'll probably just throw it in on the bottom of the screen right now in case anyone is interested. And that's really all there is to the background of this model over here. So let's go ahead and go over the box art and the graphic design. And when it came to Verlinden box arts, this was his standpoint. So all of the kits, no matter what he produced, was released in the same type of branding. So we would have a cardboard box with an M81 woodland camo scheme on it, because why not? M81 is sexy as hell. And for the image, you would actually just have a photograph of the built model in question. Generally, it would be something that he built. And again, he was a fantastic modeler, so he was also showing off some of his skills. And this here is what we have presently. So we have a nice little sticker of the built model in question, which again is a Browning 1917. By the way, he did a very nice job. It's a very handsome piece. And the remainder of the graphic design is also quite typically seen, where we have the photograph is usually on a blue background like this, black border. We have all the verbiage over here, and there was his logo, VP Productions, and it has a nice little illustration of the continent. This here is the kit in question, 2601. It's labeled as a 30 cal machine gun, even though it's more accurately should be a Browning M1917, but we can forgive that. It's in the quarter scale, and this is the only quarter scale item I have built. I don't really do stuff in quarter scale. It's not exactly a scale I'm interested in. It is an off scale. Quarter scale does have some stuff occasionally. For instance, the goat guns that are really, really popular on Facebook, those things are everywhere. Those are quarter scale, and this one here is going to be basically in that range. So it's going to be interesting to see how this thing builds out. I have a 1917, or a couple of 1917s of 1/6 scale, and they're a nice handsome piece. This thing in quarter scale is probably going to be pretty sweet, so I'm interested to see how that actually looks when I crack the box open, which I haven't done yet, by the way, so we're going to be exploring that together. This one here was made in the US, again, when he moved shop to the west of the United States. Rest of the boxes, there's nothing really much to go over here. It's just this cool M81 woodland camo. We have here a barcode. And I do want to say, I think he went to this type of box art in the 90s. So maybe this kit was released somewhere in the 1990s time frame. But That's usually when I start seeing things with this backing. But back to the model in question. So that's really all there is to the box art and graphic design. Let's go ahead and crack this open. So one thing about Verlinden, like I mentioned before, all of this stuff was made out of cast resin. So huge cutting edge technology of the era. These days here, cast resin. I mean, I still do resin castings, but 3D printing has kind of been becoming the de facto aftermarket part manufacturing method. But cast resin still has some of the benefits. All right, so opening this guy up, we'll pour out the contents. All right, so what we have here. Well, if anyone's ever built anything from Verlinden, the resin should look definitely familiar. The quality of the resin seems to be pretty good. Again, it's vintage type resin, which always had this Elmer's carpenter glue look to it. In fact, the first time I seen a resin model wasn't necessarily from Verlinden. It was from, I think, Tom's Model Works or something. My father bought a Gato class submarine 1350. He opened up the box and he's like, "What the hell is this? It's a hunk of glue." So that was my first entry or discovery into resin. It wasn't from Tom's Model Works. It was from Blue Water Navy. It was a submarine, but still. So what the hell is this? It's a hunk of glue. It's Elmer's glue. That was. That was funny times. Anyway, so let's go ahead and actually open this up. So we have 3 bags over here. Again, it's a multimedia kit, so we also have some photo etch. Again, integrally supplied. Pretty cool stuff. All right, I'm going to start by eating the vegetables by going with this runner here, this set of fret parts here. This is definitely the ammo can. The ammo can is very, very simplistic. We have the basic shape of the embossings of a 30 cal ammo can. It is missing some amenities such as the embossed lettering as well as that little strap buckle that's on the side. This is a flat casting. The quality casting is pretty good. It looks like it is pressurized, so there's no little air bubbles or pinholes to be had. And with this, and the way he casted this is he placed something on top, like a piece of glass on top of the rubber mold. So that's why we have a nice flat surface here. That's a trick done by a lot of guys out there. That's how you get this type of stuff. But this is a flat mold. You will have a wafer to sand away, and that's just normal for cast resin parts, mine included. Okay, so that's the ammo can itself. This here is the cradle, and also it's the yoke and the yoke body right there. So I can tell right now, take these 2 pieces off, glue them to these 2 sections here, and then these 2 side sections get sandwiched onto them. As for the quality of the piece, these are all, by the way, handmade resin masters. So all the masters are done the old-fashioned way, like the way I made my masters as well. Old school techniques, old school handmade craftsmanship is what went into here. And if we take a nice close-up of these sections, they look very good. Again, no air bubbles or anything like that. The pieces do look symmetrical, which for something like this is important, and it's part of the reason why I never made a 1917 tripod in cast resin, because these 2 pieces have to be literally identical. These days with 3D print, you just mirror the piece and you're good to go. But yeah, back then, not so much. You can see the actual fastener used with the bolt. You actually threaded it in, so you do see some threads over here. It's the little stuff like that that I noticed is pretty cool. And this appears probably to be a wire of some sort, or some plastic strip that he bent around to form that shape. It's really interesting to get into the mind of someone that was doing resin castings. You could see how they did it. Still, very impressive that he was able to do that. All right, next runner over here appears to be a bunch more parts. Strew them out here on the table. Whew, we got a bunch. Okay, so we have some MG parts. This here appears to be the bottom pintle for the tripod. This here is the yoke for the actual tripod itself. This probably has to be glued to the bottom section, so you have to make sure it's concentric. This little box over here is the rear sight, or a piece. It looks like a piece of the rear sight, if I'm not mistaken. One thing I do notice how big everything is. Again, quarter scale, you do get a lot more freedom compared to 1/6, even though I love 1/6 scale, but quarter scale is pretty cool specifically for weapon sets. We have here some parts for the tripod. This is the lock lever that tightens everything down. It prevents the thing from elevating. You set the elevation, you crank that down, and you're good to go. And we have a second one over here. We have 2 pieces of the same sprue. This here's your charging handle. Here goes some knobs for the sight, if I know my Brownings as well as I do. A lot of duplicate of these pieces here, perhaps in case you break one or two. It's a trick I even do. Here we have some more components for, this looks like a lock latch for the 1917 tripod, where you flip that down and it locks the thing in place. Not really sure what the other bits are at this time, but I guess I will become more well-versed as I build this thing. This is the cap for the condenser tank, which it is supplied. This to me looks like the condenser cap, if I'm not mistaken. This, of course, is your pistol grip right here. Single piece casting. Slice mold by the looks of it. Where you have the piece like this, you pour the rubber at a slice, and then the piece comes right out. Do have a little bit of a sprue there, quite typical. Masters appear to be very nicely made. Again, can't stress that enough. Okay, we have here some sections of ammo. They're individually casted, so that's going to be fun. It's basically like Link-a-Link track, but in ammunition form. It's going to be interesting to see how that goes together. That is your trigger right there for the Browning. As for these pins, not really sure. Probably has to do with the sight, if I'm not mistaken. Some sort of plug. And here we have just some other bits of components. This one here is actually threaded, some kind of a threaded rod. I think this more likely has to do with the tripod. Oh, and this is the wheel on the other side of the yoke. By the way, if you look at the instructions, I'm just going by my just visual knowledge of these things, of the Brownings. This, I believe, is the condenser cap. It looks like it has a little handle on it over there. This is something. Not really sure what that is yet. More parts, and this is, I believe, the spring for the sight. Okay, and some more gizmos here. So, that settles that. Again, as the build goes on, I will definitely be figuring this out in more depth. Before I go ahead and pour the rest of the parts out, I'm going to put some stuff away so I don't lose anything. Okay, with all the parts put away, let's go ahead and open up the next bag. This appears to be most of the big, heavy stuff, aka the fun bits. So let's go ahead and pour these out. Alright, so right off the bat, here we have the condenser tank right there, single casting. It's got a slight little bulge to it, which means the rubber mold was thin-walled over here. When you pour in the resin, if you don't have sufficient wall thickness, it'll tend to bow like that when you have the volume of fluid poured in. Again, a little boring casting stuff like that, but it should be fine. These things are all tin metal anyway, they tend to get banged up. Here we have a plate of some sort. Not really sure what this is for yet. So for the bottom of this guy, maybe? I don't know. This here is the top portion of the ammo can. It does have the inner detailing here with the embossed sheet metal look. We do have some rubber tearing in these sections over here. That just goes with the territory. When you cast stuff and continue to cast stuff, the mold does degrade, which is why resin castings, the molds are, they're not infinite. There's only so many rounds you can get out of a certain mold, and it's done. It's kind of like silkscreen printing in that regard. It does have a slight warp to it, but hit with the heat gun, and this goes straighten right out. No problems there. This is probably the side of the ammo can. Oh, that's what this is, the side of the ammo can. Okay. Here we have something. Not sure. It looks like it's a broken piece of sprue, but as for what that goes to, don't know. Okay, here's the rear sight. It appears to be warped, so that's going to have to be straightened out again. Thin resin tends to do this. This here is the top cover. Warped. As you can see, it's been in these bags for a very long time, and resin exposed to time and heat will do this, and so will 3D print for that matter. Some resin, again, resin 3D print is susceptible to this too, so I can't really complain. I think some of these parts are actually the guide mechanism, or the the feed mechanism for the belt. So this here appears to be a flash suppressor, which is pretty cool. The holes are drilled out, but some of the holes are plugged up with the rubber from the pulls, and this is something that would have to be re-drilled out with the pin vise. Just carefully go in there, hollow those out, and you'll be good to go. These are the legs for the Browning 1917. This one here is for the front leg. These two are for the two on the side because of the way they're shaped. And he does not have the hole, the pilot hole in them, so that you could adjust the thing. As a matter of fact, those levers that I was mentioning before, yeah, those are actually to tighten down on the tripod. Nicely casted though, no air bubbles to be seen. He used a dowel rod for the pouring basins on these. It's interesting, again, to get into someone else's head. Alright, this here is the body of the tripod itself. Looks like that other piece was the front portion of the leg. You have a little T-slot here, glue that in, and now you have your leg. As for why he didn't just mold that integral, not sure. Alright, here we have the receiver of the Browning itself. The 1917 and the 1919 essentially have the exact same receiver, it's just the rear sight that's different, more or less. We have here the feed paw mechanism right over there. The bolt carrier is integrally molded on, so it's not a separate piece. So you can't render it with the piece being functional, but then again, 1917s and 1919s are closed bolts, so it wouldn't lock back like it would, say, on an open bolt MG. So that doesn't really change anything. As for the cam mechanism, it's there, it's rendered in. As for how he made that, it looks like he carved it, maybe on a mill or something. Looks pretty good. It's fair, it does the job just fine. He has the riveting on the bottom securing plate right over there. And yeah, it's got all the appropriate detailing for a Browning. Should sand away pretty well and make for an overall interesting piece. But of course, the coolest part of the Browning 17 is of course the water jacket. And by the way, I'm just coming off of doing some water-cooled M2, so yeah, I'm pretty ready for something like this. So the water jacket, single molding, as you can see, it appears to be nice and straight. It's not warped, or if it is warped, it's not warped where it's noticeable. On the back over here, we have a small little pouring basin. This does need to be sanded. This you have to be really careful with, because if you're sanding this by hand or on a belt sander, you could easily Gumby it, and if that's the case, you're screwed. Something like this, I'm probably have to turn on the lathe, because that will ensure that the piece is nice and true. Same thing is also true for the receiver over here. There's a small little slight bend, as you can see. That's got to be straightened off, and I'll put this in the mill and mill that away so it's nice and flat. As for the bottom over here, I could use the mill for that as well, and just polish it down with some sanding. The one ding that the kit does have, I will say, is that the bottom of the receiver is solid. And of course, anyone knows the thing or two about Brownings, they are bottom eject. So this section here should all be open. So that's one mistake that the kit does have. But again, for the way the thing needs to be molded, that's probably why he went with that approach. So the next item to mention is this bag over here that has the non-resin bits. And starting with the piece of photo etch, here we can see the parts. The PE is nice and thick, and it's actually made out of copper. And this is what I've seen on several other of the Verlinden kits in the past, or from the ones I was able to see. The pieces look excellent. Matter of fact, it was a good idea to roll with photo etch for several of these components because, well, they would be sheet metal stamped on the real unit, so photo etch would be a smart choice. We can see here the cam mechanism for the top cover. Like I said before, they were separately molded parts, and the use of PE on that's actually a pretty good one. You can see here some other parts for the latch for the ammo can, as well as a few other gizmos. This here, I believe, is the ammo can slot, or it might be an optic slot, a little hazy, but these appear to be the clips that hold the ammo can in place. So really interesting. I like the way he integrally etched on over there in depth 30 cal MG 1/4. It's pretty cool. I might keep that and use it as a name plaque or something. And that, by the way, is the original item number 881. That was when the things were originally released. Okay, we also have a tube over here, of course, to plug the bottom portion of the water jacket into the condenser tank. We have here a little length of copper rod, a thin plastic tube, a strip of lead, and also some chain. So, it's a good thing I'm wearing gloves with the lead. So there you go. That's pretty interesting. It's not really something you see much given these days in aftermarket parts. Our components made from lead foil. So that's pretty interesting. That's all there is to that. This takes us to the instructions. So here we have the instruction sheet. Again, as one would imagine being a kit from this era, the instructions are going to be very, very minimalistic. So we can see here that the original address is the one out in Belgium. So if I was to take a guess, I would say that the original release, or his original parts, were produced while he lived in Belgium. Then he moved to the US and did the second batch. And he just never updated the paperwork. Although he did have some kind of a whiteout on this section over here. Not really sure what's there, but again, it's a data point to reference. Age is 14 and up, and I gotta say there's no way in hell a 14-year-old is gonna put this together. This is a pretty advanced kit. So it's not that it's advanced, but it takes special skill sets with working with cast resin and things like that. And most 14-year-olds didn't have that. Even when I was 14, I was dabbling with some resin stuff, and something like this would be, yeah, it wouldn't work out too well. But anyway, I think I should be able to build this. There goes the part list right over there. He has a good breakdown of what the parts are, what their numbers, and then on the back side over here, we have a nice little exploded diagram of everything, and that just looks pretty cool. If I didn't say so myself. Jumping forward a little bit takes us to the point that we have here where the tripod is, for all intents and purposes, ready for painting. The components are mostly all stock, however I did deviate here or there just to improve the model somewhat, as I usually do. So let me temporarily remove the cradle, and we'll start with the tripod itself. So everything here is a multi-piece assembly, so you have to make sure the alignment is going to be lining up absolutely perfectly. This is where you're going to need to take your time, pump your brakes, and measure twice and glue once. This is specifically true for these legs over here, where they can easily be glued on askew. Once those are permanently attached though, and everything is lined up, you should be good to go. As we saw earlier, I went ahead and drilled this guy out here, as well as a matching unit over here found on the bottom of the cradle. I'll mention that momentarily. This is definitely something that's not kit included, and the kit just wants you to glue the things straight onto the piece over here flat. Obviously, this is doable. It will have the unit in a way where it can't rotate the thing or pivot it. It kind of makes it a bit dull in my opinion. But also, more importantly, it will actually make alignment a bit harder to do it the kit way as opposed to what I did with the alignment. With this way, the piece will sit in its appropriate location and it'll be nice and true, as opposed to trying to eyeball your way to get the thing to fit on correctly. Can it be done with some careful measurements? Yes, but again, in my opinion, it's a bit dull. Moving down to the legs themselves, here you can see where I went ahead and made some modifications. The unit had the pins just integrally molded into the sections over here, and you essentially just keep the legs into their place with the use of just adhesives. This is a horribly weak design, and it's something that definitely leaves room for improvement. So what I went ahead and did was I drilled out the molded-in fasteners, and I replaced them with real brass fasteners like you can see here. The brass is much stronger compared to the way the unit was originally, so with these units now drilled out with the brass sections in place, this gives much more rigidity and strength to the component compared to leaving it stock. The only catch is that when you're aligning everything, you want to make sure that the tripod is nice and true, because with the way these tripods are, they can shift a little bit depending on the location of the legs. But if you are going to make sure everything's lined up, it's a bit challenging, specifically while the glues are setting, you should be good to go. In addition to the modification of the rod, I also have to drill out the portion here of the little levers where we do have a fastener integrally molded on, and oddly enough, the guy who made the master went ahead and utilized the exact same 256 bolts that I used for the actual pinning itself, so that's kind of advantageous. On the pintle lock over here, this is a bit of detailing that I deviated from the kit with. The kit, I believe, just wants you to use a piece of wire or something along those lines. However, in real life, they would have this T-handle here, much along the lines we see on vices. For the detailing, I basically lifted a technique that I use on my 1/6 scale, or I used to use on my 1/6 scale counterparts, where I use just two wire brads, and I just clip them at different lengths, And when I install them into the section here that was drilled out, you get the appearance that you see here, and it leaves for a very realistic look. It's a great way to have the little ball found on each ends here of the little lever, and it's one that happens naturally because of the shape of the wire brads. The last thing I want to mention are the feet. You'll notice that on these ones here, the feet get glued into these two locations. These are separate molded components, so you have to deburr them, sand them, and then mount them into the correct locations. However, on the M1917 tripod, the one in the front has this larger spade type shape over here, and this was something that was scratch built out of a length of plastruct, carved it to shape, and then mounted the following location, leaving for the end result that you see here. That's all there is with the tripod, and this brings us to the cradle. So the cradle, for all intents and purposes, is complete at this time. I do need to go ahead and make a small little hole or two found on the side panels, so I could go ahead and mount the eyelets for the chain retention system that's found on these Browning MGs. But that's something that I'm going to be mentioning a little bit later. For the piece itself, it goes together pretty well. However, this is something where, again, if you're not used to working on these old school resin garage type kits, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. So the first thing I want to mention is the yoke section here. Not really the yoke, but technically it is part of the yoke. It's the main yoke of the cradle, and then we have the pintle that emerges from the bottom portion. This is something that I, again, tooled up on the lathe, turned it from a piece of resin stock to the appropriate shape. And then I had to carefully center it on this portion over here, which was something that took a little bit of finesse, but I was able to pull it off. With this in place, now the piece just drops directly into the location, and not only does it secure it in nice and tight, and it prevents the piece from falling off, but as you can see, I can still rotate this thing 360 degrees, which is absolutely perfect. Also, for the yoke itself, this again is a multi-piece assembly, where we have these two little wing sections over here that need to be deburred, carefully sanded down flush, and then mounted to the appropriate locations, and done so in a square manner. Again, this is where the tooling of the kit starts to show its age. Stuff like this is not really done these days, specifically with 3D prints. But anyway, back in the day, this is how we rolled with it. The panels themselves were also carefully sanded down. Here's basically an idea of what the wafer looks like that the things are casted on, and you have to carefully carve these pieces off of the, or I should say subdivide this section, and then on a belt sander, you have to carefully just sand down just the right amount of material to get the piece to the proper thickness. This is, again, old school resin kit at its finest. If you do not have a belt sander, you're screwed. You're not going to be able to go ahead and properly clean it out. And if you do have a belt sander, you have to stay on the ball, because there are 7 different ways from Sunday to screw up the sanding. Just by holding the piece down, if you're looking at it a certain way, you could maybe line up this way, but you might have a yaw to it, and you'll oversand in one section, undersand it in another section, and this is something that happens on every axis. So it sounds daunting, but if you've done enough of these things, it kind of becomes secondhand nature. But once you are able to get the thicknesses done right, the piece actually looks quite nice. For the hollowed out sections here, this was carefully cleaned up further with a needle file, and just go in there and just polish down the little sections until it's nice and smooth. This is actually quite important, specifically for the smile section that we have here, because this is actually going to be relevant for the peg that we have that secures the piece together. Back to the cradle side sections, you then have to physically assemble it much along the lines of you would on the real one. So the best way to do it is first with the assembly of the trunnion. The trunnion here is a piece of thick gauge copper photo etch that needs to be bent to shape, and fortunately it bends quite easily. However, if you follow the kit's instructions, you're going to run into a mistake. And that is right over here. So here you can see the piece where it's all folded together, and then it just locks into these 2 sections here of the side plates with these wires that pin it together. Decent enough with the assembly. However, if you follow this, you're going to make a mistake. The reason is this piece is upside down in the illustration. I have no idea how that happened, but this is not how it's supposed to be lined up. If you assemble it this way, which by the way I did, it wasn't until I was dry fitting the receiver, I'm like, uh-oh, there's a problem here. So this is actually how it's supposed to be lined up correctly. And it also makes sense. We have this little lock tab over here, which on the real one, it's used to secure this little thing in place. And if you ever worked or been around these Brownings, they kind of have this type of a design to them, where you just slap it down and it spring clips in place. With the way the piece is designed, the spring clip boxes in together, and again, folds really well if you have a nice precision needle nose plier. This one here, I was actually missing one of the side tabs, so I actually had to solder a little piece of metal to it just to complete the look. I'm not sure if it was on my example, if it was missing, or if it's something that is found on the other, just on these Verlinden kits, but it's definitely something to be aware of. As for the pinning, I went ahead and actually drilled out these sections over here, and I used a wire brad to physically pin everything in place. The kit suggests that you use a supply piece of copper wire, but it's a bit flimsy in my opinion. The steel wire brads are much more durable and stronger. And this is something that's actually very important because it jigs and keeps everything in square, in line, and that's something that you really need to have. The fasteners are more or less in the right locations. I just drilled out the center portions with a Dremel, and then the pins just sort of went to their appropriate locations. The super glue, once secured in these areas over here, this thing acts as a trunnion, and it really does brace everything together and keeps it pretty steady. From there, I went ahead and drilled out these two sections over here, and I added two little pieces of floor wire in these sections in order to give the detailing here and also the required structured detailing for the rear struts. On the elevation mount that we have right here, this is the kit one. It is a multi-piece assembly. On the elevation knob, I actually went ahead and used the lathe on both this section and this section here in order to ensure that the piece was first deburred off of the pouring basin, and then also to make sure that the hole was drilled nice and square in the center so I could use a piece of wire to glue the pieces together, which ensures that everything is nice as straight as humanly possible. Something like this, if it's something that's canted, it's not going to do you any favors. This guy here then just slides into this rail. You do have to draw out these two little holes over here in order to do that. But then the one piece that's actually missing on this kit is the threaded section for the transverse. So on the 1917, you can actually adjust the transverse of the receiver by rotating this large knob here a few clicks either left or right. And this is done with a large threaded screw in this section over here, and it's topped off here with a fastener. Now on the kit, the fastener detailing is integrally molded on here, and the large screw knob is supplied, but that's just basically meant to get glued in this location here flat, and then you're absent the threading. What's also interesting to point out is that the elevation mechanism here has a half moon cutout found in this section so that it can fit around a round bar like I've done over here. So it seems like that they were planning on it, but I guess they just never implemented it. As you can see right here in the instructions, that detailing is indeed absent. So what did I do? Well, quite simply put, I found a M2.5 fastener in my spare fastener bin. I went ahead and I cut it to shape. I turned this knob over here, again, nice and flat to remove the pouring basin, so it's nice and totally flat, and that's also crucial because it needs to mount to the fastener here. Fastener was originally a slot screw. On the lathe, I flattened the slot section, so it's a nice thin little wafer so that it slides into this area over here, and then this guy just tops it off, leaving for the end result that you see presently. On the reverse side, just a little drop of glue and a matching fastener was used just to tighten it in place and leave for the final end result. This does both structure and also detailing, which again is quite beneficial. When you are assembling this piece, you want to make sure everything is as flat and as square as humanly possible. If this thing is yawing in one way or another, it's not going to do you any favors. The two sections are not quite even with each other. This is, again, is indicative of the handmade nature of the masters, but it's good enough for the job at hand, and that's the best you're going to get with one of these old school type handmade units. The next thing to reference is with the yoke itself. So one slight modification I made was I added two little pins found in these two sections here so that I can actually get the thing to elevate. Yes, I can not only transverse, but I can elevate as well. The way the kit's designed, that's not the case. This thing's just supposed to be glued static to the side over here, and you call it a day. But again, that's boring. You don't want to be boring. So in order to do this, first I need to modify these two little areas, and I also have to modify the retention bolt. On the real unit, this little lever over here, you loosen it, and then you could position the elevation a little bit more quickly, and then tighten it down, and now it keeps in its proper position. And then for fine-tuning, that's what these other knobs are for. So let me just go ahead and quickly loosen these guys up. So these are the kit supplied parts, just slightly modified. Here's the end section right over here. I drilled out this section by first, again, squaring it off on the lathe, then drilling it out on the lathe to ensure that it is as straight as humanly possible. The piece does have a small little divot found molded into the side, so you can drill out and install a piece of rod. Again, the kit wants you to use a piece of copper wire, but it's a bit flimsy. I replaced that with a 1/16 of an inch steel piece of floor wire, much more rigid, not going to bend or anything. So much better material for this. Glued it in just enough so that it sits into the material over here, but not too much where it's going to inhibit it sliding onto the threaded rod. That's obviously very important. The other section of the piece is right here. Let me just go ahead and pop this guy out. Again, kit supply component. This guy here was molded actually hollow, but the wafer was on this section over here, and it was a flat type mold, or I should say a flat type casting, much along the lines of this guy over here. So fortunately with the shape, I was able to put this guy in my lathe and square the fella off. And I also give a nice little radius around the edge, as what we would commonly see on these type of units. And again, it's one of the best ways to do this. If you notice on this kit over here, a lathe and a mill are probably going to be very beneficial. Mandatory? I would say no, not necessarily, but it'll definitely make the job a hell of a lot easier and the final outcome come out a lot better. Anyway, so since the section was integrally molded hollow, I went ahead and found another 2.5 fastener, trimmed it to shape, installed into this section here. So now I actually have the threads found on the piece, which are going to look very nice once everything is painted. With that removed, let me go ahead and quickly pop this guy off. So this is actually very similar to my 1/6 scale water-cooled Browning mounts that are very similar to the design of this. And what I did was here, I actually went ahead and drilled out the two sections here of the retention nuts, and I went and found some spare sprue that was in my scrap bin, clipped it to shape, drilled a small little hole into each, and I used a steel piece of floor wire to glue the piece to the sides. Now I have these two little pegs over here, and they will just clip into the yoke. The yoke, by its nature, is a bit flexible, like this. Not overly flexible, but just enough so that the piece can slip in. So basically for installation, and this again, I have to paint it separately like this, so it's going to be important in order to assemble it. I just slip this guy in place like so. Just squeeze these two together. And then click! It finds its little happy sweet spot, and the piece can pivot about. One modification I am going to have to make to the receiver is with the way the kit is designed, these holes in the yoke here are integrally molded in, and they're quite large, if you might notice, and that's because there are two corresponding lugs here found on the side of the receiver. This is not correct to the 1917. This here was purely done by Verlinden so that you can line the kit up and install the piece permanently. So, as you'll notice, I put a little black dot on these. These are going to be amputated out and sanded nice and flush. I'm also going to do something down here, but more on that to come. The last thing I want to mention on the cradle involves the ammo can holder. This is also made from photo etch, and frankly, it's probably one of the best ways to do it, specifically back in the day before print. Now, these days, even on my sets, they are 3D printed, but the photo etch does look actually quite nice. It's to scale, and it just, PE does have some benefits to it, and stuff like this is one of them. However, it is a two-piece assembly, so you do have to go ahead and affix these pieces in the correct location. And there are no suggestion points or anything along those lines, either on the side portion of the cradle or even on the metal parts themselves. The instructions are a bit vague. There's not exactly an idea where it goes, more or less a guideline. And the photograph of the built model here is, one, really small, and two, it's on the wrong side. And this is literally the only photograph of the thing, so you're going to have to, it opens up some room for interpretation. Fortunately, these days, just go on Google, find a picture of an M1917 Browning tripod, and you should be able to find more than enough information out there. And that's exactly what I did over here, and I first installed the piece. First, I have to bend everything to shape. Bend's super easy. It's really easy bending, again, due to the size and the type of bends we're talking about. Nothing that's overly complex. Once the things are all bent up to shape, I actually went ahead and glued this fella here to the side of the cradle. Once the glue's set, I actually used the cradle as a jig in many ways. I then carefully lined up the bracket over here, added a smear of flux, and then I soldered it directly to the piece. If you'll notice, I did not use glue, I used solder. The reason why I use solder is because it's a hell of a lot stronger compared to glues. Why this is relevant? Well, on a tripod MG like this, the ammo can slips into this section over here, so you have that extra weight. And glues alone, in my opinion, are just not going to be enough to hold this thing up. So solder is definitely the best way to do it. During the soldering, once the soldering was done, the piece actually popped off. The glues got hot from the residual heat and failed. However, by the time that happened, the solder was solidified, the piece was good to go, and I had now a good indication of where the thing was originally. So once the piece was cooled off, 2 little drops of glue later, and the piece is now firmly back in its place. Still with me? Cool. Right? So that's all there is to the cradle, and this is really the bulk of the work here. There is one more thing I need to do, like I mentioned before, is make a little eyelet on the back, either on this side or I think there's one on either side, and that's going to be used for the chain retention piece that pins the Browning together. And that's something I'm going to be mentioning towards the latter half of the video. So from here, we can now turn our attention to the receiver. Jumping directly back to the receiver, as I mentioned before, it's nothing more than, well, a solid hunk of glue. It has the basic shape of a Browning receiver, sans a few little appendages that our kit supplied, but basically what you see here is what you get. However, the kit does omit quite a bit of detailing, specifically on the underside over here, which, as you can see, I kind of sketched out a little bit for the under detailing that I'm going to be getting to in a moment. However, in order to get the piece properly detailed out, I need to have some really good references on the bottom portion of a Browning, specifically a 1917. Unfortunately, finding pictures of the bottom portions of these receivers on basically most of the Brownings from the M2 to the 1919 and 1917 series is actually a bit trickier said than done. There's not really a whole lot of pictures there online, because generally people are not really taking pictures of this area here of these units. However, fortunately, I am very fortunate to have access to some excellent reference material on a Browning system. However, it's not a 1917, it is its later cousin, the 1919, well specifically 1919 A4, but either way, I think it should be close enough for me to go ahead and outfit this thing and improve it further. As for what that reference is, well, it's my Browning 1919 A4. So here we have it taken out of its Safe Queen location, and I have it here just placed into the shop. So as you can see, the bottom portion here of the Browning system has a lot of details going on down here, and these are all absent here on the stock Verlinden casting. So first thing I'm going to do, as you can see here, I already drew out this area here for the ejection port area, and I also have to go ahead and model in the area for the front trunnion, as well as the bolt carrier group and the barrel extension. That's all, basically all this stuff right over here. If I rack it, you'll be able to see this stuff in better detail. Let's see if I can do that while holding in this awkward position. So, there you go. There we go. Alright, so there you can see the unit in action. There is a little notch found in this section over here. There is this fastener that holds in place a locking wedge in this area. Obviously, that's not going to be important for this build, but I am going to have to fabricate the fastener. But most importantly, you'll see that this area here is scalloped right here on the inside. And that's definitely something I am going to be adding to this one over here. Now, like I mentioned before, I just want to preface this. I'm not sure if the 1917 has this, because there were a lot of changes between the 1917 and the 1919. Remember, this thing here evolved from the 17, but for all intents and purposes, this guy here essentially is the same, so I'm pretty sure these details here, if not are identical, are very similar to the ones on the 17. And frankly, if anyone's out there that knows this, feel free to put that in the comments section below. But I'm going to be modeling what I know, and I know the 1919 fairly well, for reasons that should be obvious. Anyway, so now that you see what I'm going to be using as my reference guide, it's time to go ahead and start making some modifications to this solid hunk of glue. So to do the various cuts that I'm going to require, I'm going to utilize the mill. The mill is the best chance to ensure that the right amount of material is removed in the correct locations and done in an even manner. In order to get the unit milled out, of course, the piece needs to be firmly clamped into the vise. And this is where you're going to have to think a little bit outside the box, because with the way the receiver is shaped, we have lots of little frail detail appendages that stick out of the sides, and this is something that's going to be destroyed if you just go ahead and clamp it traditionally. So what I went ahead and did was I had these little square sticks over here that I picked up after, or I should say on the 5th of July, and for my European audience out there, 4th of July is a huge celebration, a lot of fireworks, a lot of bottle rockets, and on the 5th of July, there are tons of spent bottle rockets all over the place, and I actually walk around my neighborhood picking up the sticks because they are fantastic for use in hobbies. Case in point. So I have these squared off sticks over here. I went ahead and just cut them to length, and these are a perfect buffer to go ahead and ensure that the piece is secured permanently and securely in the vise. See, if I go ahead and crank down on that. However, it's not going to cause any sort of damage to the appendages whatsoever, because where the squares are making contact with the receiver, it's just flat, solid resin. Also on that note, one advantage about the thing being solid resin, this is the perfect material to go ahead and machine out to get the various cuts that you desire. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. However, one thing I am going to have to do is square it off. It seems that the piece is slightly off square. It's a little canted, but that's not a problem. Now that the top portion is totally square and the piece is measured out, I can go ahead and do some facing with the mill over here, and that'll ensure a nice flat surface, and then I can go ahead and start making the appropriate cuts. And after a bit of scratch building later, here is the end result. So obviously a lot went into this section over here, changing it from the kit original. After the material was removed from this section here via the mill, I went ahead and fabricated the trunnion section, which you can see here on the inside. This here is just fabricated out of a chunk of cast resin that I have lying around, formed it to shape, and then mounted inside, and I glued a little half section of round spare sprue in order to get this nice little blister section that we have here. Also drill that hole right there in the center. Hopefully it comes out on camera, but there's a hole in here with a plug, and that is present right here on the model. I fabricated the inner frame section of the BCG. And you can see that right over here. This is just fabricated out of sections of Plastruct strip. And then I also hogged out this area over here, giving you this bit of detailing. The one thing that I kind of made a mistake with was with the scalloping on this section over here. And on the model itself, when I was doing the procedure, I tried something new where I tried jigging it inside of my vise, and then having the mill just hog out this area over here. And the system was working. I had the vicing done perfectly. Unfortunately, I did not have the proper bit to do the milling, and I was trying to use a substitute. Didn't work, and I basically screwed it up. Fortunately, I was not able to panic too much, because what I did was I just milled away more material, then I just rebuilt it with sections of Plastruct strip. After the Plastruct was built, I went ahead and sculpted it to the look of the scallops, like you see back here. And then from there, I was able to continue with the build. Also went ahead and added that fastener that you can see right here. This was just fabricated out of a piece of scrap sprue, cut it to shape, added a little slice right there for the fastener, and then mounted it in a hole that was drilled in. On the rear section over here, I also went ahead and added some more detailing. Well, let me go ahead and readjust the camera. With the camera readjusted on the real one here, you have to see in better depth. So on a 19, or I should say just on a Browning system, the entire rear plate is removable to get access to the guts on the inside. And the piece just slides into two little rails here found on the receiver. Well, on the model over here, this was just cast as a solid block of resin, so I had to go ahead and add these little details. These were added via a Dremel Multimaster, where I just oscillate cut these two little slits into these two sections here. Fortunately, this one here, I was kind of in the wrong spot, so I had to plug up the strip with a little bit of strip styrene, blend it in, and then add the cut to the appropriate location. But once added, it definitely improves the look of the piece overall. On this section over here, I add this small little protrusion. On the real unit, we have this little section over here, and it looks like a little slot screw with a really long extended neck. This is actually the mainspring, and the way these things are specifically on these type of versions, you take a slot screw and you push this guy in and you twist it, and this will lock the protrusion here inside the bolt, and this will allow you then to remove the whole back plate. Well, on the model over here, I went ahead and fabricated out of a small little strip, or a little piece of wire. Fortunately, I couldn't add the slit the scale is kind of small to do that, but I do have the protrusion regardless, so it does add the extra accuracy. On the bottom portion here of the grip, on this section here on the forging, you can see this little strip right here. It's a rigidity strip that was absent on the model here, so I fabricated out of a little strip of sheet styrene. The trigger mechanism is just a stock one, cast resin, snipped it to the appropriate shape, and by snipping I mean removing it off the sprue, and then I went ahead and just mounted it to the bottom portion as it's needed. Moving our way to the front takes us to the front trunnion section over here, and this is also something that's actually very relevant because on these Brownings there are two spacers found on this section right over here. There's no one on the opposite side, slightly out of frame, but basically they're these two tombstone shaped objects, and they act as a spacer from the standoff on the receiver so it can mount to the yoke. On the model over here, these were absent, so I went ahead and scratch built them out of just a little strip of sheet styrene, cut it to the appropriate shape, mounted it to the appropriate locations, and I drilled them out. And on the model over here, this just gets pinned to the yoke, which will allow the piece to pivot. On the original kit, this is not the case. The piece actually is quite loose, and it's just meant to be glued statically in place. But again, as I mentioned before, having the piece articulate makes the piece a little bit more interesting. Outside of that, on the side portion here, we have the charging handle, stock original, simply utilized. However, I did drill it out a little bit as it was a bit plugged. It was a shallow casting, and this was done, again, for casting reasons. But if we take a look here again at the real one, you can see that the piece is quite deep on the inside. Another thing that I did was on the unit over here, there was some casting spludge on the inner rail section. This happens when you're casting a lot. This is when the molds start to wear out after a number of castings or so. Sometimes little undercuts like this will rip out with the rubber, and then you'll have what looks like jaggy rocks or cliffs found on these pieces over here. They're simply removed with a little X-Acto. They just slice straight off, and then the pieces are back to original spec. I did have to drill these holes out slightly. They were a little shallow, again, due to the original rubber being ripped out at some point in time in the casting sessions. So by drilling them out, again, it restored the piece back to its original shape. Alright, now this brings us to the inside portion, namely the top cover, and this is actually something that's quite important. So before I go ahead and do that, let me just briefly go into Forgotten Weapons territory and show exactly how does this thing work, because it is relevant. Alright, so on the Browning system, this is true for the 1919, 1917, the M2. The way these things work is that we have the feed paw mechanism up here on top of the top cover. We have the feedway, this is where the belt goes, and then we have the carrier and the bolt, as well as the lifter over here, all in this section. And when this thing is operating, the feed paw over here clips over it. When you rack it, it moves outward like that. It then grabs, it snaps over the one cartridge on the belt, and then when it returns, it snags it and pulls it into this section over here. When it pulls it into this section, this guy here clips onto the base of the cartridge itself, and then when it's cycling back, you see how the piece drops down? Well, what it's doing is that it's actually pulling the cartridge out of the belt. Then this mechanism here is pushing it downward so it can slide onto the bolt, and then when the carrier goes back forward again, the piece chambers into the chamber, and then it's ready to cycle. Well, while this is going on, we have on the top cover over here a bunch of stuff happening here that is very, very important. So we have this long arm with this pin on the end. Has another hinge pin over here. It's connected to the feed paw mechanism, and then we have these other two bits of equipment. One is a flat spring, and the other one is just this ramp type structure. So as I mentioned before, this piece here goes out, snaps onto the next cartridge, and it helps pulls it in. Well, that is controlled via this linkage over here, and that linkage runs in this slot here found on the bolt carrier. Going back to this guy over here, remember, like I said before, he needs to drop down in order to help position the round. Well, on the side plate over here, there's a bunch of tracks that are milled in. However, in order to assist this, on the top cover, we have this spring section. Right here, it's just a flat spring. And this is putting pressure on that little mechanism to push it downward. And also we have this ramp over here to again ensure that the piece can function properly. So going back over here, when it's cycling, the piece is basically acting like my finger, and it's pushing the piece down like this, and then it could cycle back up to do what it needs to do. If that arm and mechanism is not there, it tends to hang up. But if everything is properly aligned, you can see how the thing just cycles and cycles and cycles. And that is right over here. So if I flip it over, we get to see some of the internal components. And let me position it this way. So the kit supplies you with the resin top cover itself, and then it supplies you with some of the feed mechanisms that I just went over. And the pieces are made out of photo etch, and they are properly shaped. However, they could use a little bit of tweaking. So first, on the cam arm that we have right here, you'll notice that it's standing off from the resin top cover. With the way the kit is designed, you're just supposed to glue it flat to the piece, or at least that's what the instructions show. However, if we look at the real one again, you'll see that that's not the case, and the piece is hanging off of the top cover, and there's a little bit of clearance over here for the thing to cycle. So on the model over here, what I went ahead and did was, the piece, by the way, does have a hole that's integrally photo etched into this section. I drilled it out slightly with a router bit, and I slipped on the inside portion over here, the head of a nail. The piece was glued to it, and this gives, as you can see, the proper standoff required in order to have the piece be a bit more realistic. The next thing I addressed was with the flat spring. So on the spring itself, you can see it has some geometry to it. It's not just a flat piece. The piece is flat over here, then it bends up and goes this way until finally it hits onto that fastener right over here. On the model over here, the piece, of course, being photo etched, is totally flat. So what I went ahead and did was I just went ahead and bent it to shape with a pair of pliers, and then just glued it to the appropriate location. Also, on that note, there's no guides or anything on this section here on where these components go. Fortunately, again, I had the real one over here, so I was able to carefully draw everything out on where the pieces all go in their retracted format like this over here. So this was something that was a great aid for me. However, if you're building one of these things, obviously finding photographs of these online are fairly easily done. The next thing to do was something I had to scratch build, and that was the ramp right here. This was totally absent on the kit and was something that was easily fabricated on just a piece of Plastrux strip. I got this thing in focus. There we go. I had to go ahead and just carve it into this angled section that we have here, round it off the edges to make it match the real one. That's all there is to that. The other thing I went ahead and fabricated was that little arm that we have right here on the feed palm mechanism. This was fabricated a piece of floor wire. It was bent to shape, then flattened in order to better replicate the look of the real guy that we have right here on the bottom. On the exterior portion of the top cover, takes to this little device that we have here, and this is this little spring device that basically helps with the opening and closing of the top cover. If I go ahead and pop this thing open, you see it just keeps it in a locked position with some kind of a spring detent, and it prevents this thing from flopping around very, very loose, which is something that you really don't want to have to go through when you're loading or working on this thing. This thing is flopping around, potentially slamming on your hands. Not exactly a nice feature. So the spring device here does a good job with, again, having a nice little detent, so it makes it a bit easier to work on. On the model one over here, the detent section is decently rendered out. You can see it has an actual spring that was on the master that he went ahead and mounted in this area over here. However, this is a separate piece and does have to be glued on. Now, this is again where I deviated from the kit. The kit just wants you to glue this static either in the open or closed position, but that's boring. So I went ahead and drilled it out, and this allows me to have the piece be fully functional, where I can display this in either the open or closed condition. The piece, first I just mount it onto the model. I put the pin through, drilled a hole in this guy, and I just basically used the pin to line everything up, so the piece now is one solid piece. And the functionality is still there, and we'll see that as the video goes on. And this brings us to something that is different from my 1919 here. It's definitely a 1917 piece, and that is most certainly the rear sight. So the rear sight on the 1917 is a gorgeous bit of equipment. It's a bit over-engineered, but you could definitely see that this was a product of its era. Nicely machined, and if anyone is a fan of my water-cooled Browning videos, it's basically the exact same type of sight. The model over here is comprised of 3 pieces. So we have the box section, we have the knob, and we have the ladder sight. The box section, totally stock. I just had to carefully sand it down a little bit where the pouring section was, and then it was good for installation. Installation, again, you want to be careful. There's no alignment points or anything. You just basically have this little lug over here that's found on the back portion here of the top cover. And this is a great point. Oop, camera. This fella right here. This guy here is a great point to help line up the rear sight block because, again, it's a nice flat surface. And on the real one, it is found in that location. The other component is the knob. It's just a nice resin casting. I did have to carefully remove it off the sprue. I flattened it and faced it off on the lathe, so again, it's nice and flat as humanly possible. And then I went ahead and glued it to the side portion here. No indication points, but on this side here, you can see this little fastener for the rear sight, and this guy here would be on the direct opposite of that. The bottom portion of the rear sight, this little tube structure, is integrally molded in, so this gives you a good indication point of where this piece actually gets fitted. A little drop of super glue, you carefully line it up, let it sit and dry, and you're done. And this brings us to the rear sight. The rear sight is something that could use some improvement. Very, very basic, very, very rudimentary, which is the opposite of what the rear sights would be on these units. My sight is far from perfect, but it's definitely a leg up compared to the stock original. So on the original, it does have a peep sight integrally molded in. It's very shallow, and frankly, it's kind of in the wrong location. So I was looking at some pictures of real ones, and I went ahead and cobble together just some pieces of plastic to get you the look that we have here. So the first thing is these rear sights have not 1 but 2 peepholes in place. Specifically in the ladder type sight, we have this bottom peephole over here and this top one. The top one actually can be adjustable with this knob, which was also fabricated. It has this long threaded rod, which has also been something that was fabricated with a length of 3D print sprue that I had lying around. And this guy here is the peep sight, and this whole thing would go up and down, either if you go left or right with the knob. The windage is controlled by this little knob over here, and then there's another windage knob right over here, and that's not including the windage on the tripod itself. A lot of duplicates on this setup. On the bottom peep sight, it actually stands above the piece itself. This was made from a thin piece of sheet styrene. I drew it out, and then I carefully just went in there with a file and carved it away till I had the shape I was happy with, bent it to shape, glued it to this location, add some third dimension to it. The other peep sight, which is right there, that's for use when the ladder sight is in the down position, and you just have a standard peep sight like you would on a rifle. The peep sight itself is a plastic tube. This is actually something that came with the set. On the lathe, I was able to carefully cut the piece off without any burrs, glue it to the appropriate location, and I was good to go. For this peep sight over here, this is just a piece of plastic, again, styrene strip that was cut to shape, hole drilled down the center, and was carefully fit into this area over here. On the kit, there is this sacrificial plate that's found on the back end. You have to carefully polish that down with a file so that it opens up the center portion, and you have to be careful because you could accidentally oversand, and that's something that can cause some issues. Once everything is all properly done, though, the sight, again, for the most part, does the job pretty well. I also fabricated the windage knob right over here, just some chunks of plastic floating around the bench, and I was able to cobble the following unit. Once everything's painted and weathered, it will definitely look much better. The piece is either in the open or closed position. You cannot make this thing function not without doing a little bit of extra modifications to the piece, but for this build over here with the time constraints that I'm working with, what we have here is perfectly fine, and it kind of looks cool in the open position. And also, it being in the open position, I can still open up the top cover because the top cover, of course, opens forward on these units. So there's no risk of the rear sight here getting damaged or snagged up on anything. One other difference between the 17 and the 19 really quick is with this carve out right over here. This is something not found on the 17s. And was something that was added later on the 1919, specifically maybe the 1919 A4s, if I'm not mistaken. Or I believe that might have been an Israeli mod, either one or the other. Obviously, this is S308 1919, and it's definitely one that saw service with the IDF. But anyway, that's basically what we have in a nutshell, and that was done. The only reason why this notch was here was actually a nice little modification. Memory serves done by the Israelis, and this was so that the top cover doesn't bottom out and hit the rear sight here when it's folded up. Because you always forget to flip this thing open, and you're always striking the top cover. Yes, that was definitely an Israeli thing, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, enough with that. Enough with this over here. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to get the unit assembled back on the receiver, and you get to see what it looks like. And here's the model fully assembled. Now this one here is actually ready to slide off of the paint. Before I do though, let me just bring the camera in closer so you get to see what was added to the front end section, since the receiver section already went through in a little bit more depth. So taking the unit off, I already popped the pin in the back, and the piece just lifts off from here. The one thing I noticed is that there is no locking section in this area, which of course there would be on the real unit. For the model over here, it's just going to be glued in place when the time does come. Alright, so, the jacket. Let's go ahead and start with the jacket. So the jacket is the most substantial resin casting found on the entire set. It's even more substantial than the receiver itself. So the jacket is a solid chunk of resin that you do have to square off. Now I tried to go ahead and turn this on the lathe to ensure that the piece was nice and straight as possible. Unfortunately, the jacket is not exactly a true casting. And what I mean by that is the piece is not straight. It actually has some bends and contours to it, and this is something that can happen when you're casting with a long tube-like structure. Deformation is a thing, as I mentioned before with the cooling jacket over here, how you have that blister. For long tube-like structures, because of the nature of the rubber molds, these things tend to flex a little bit, and this is something that's not uncommon. Why this is relevant that I'm pointing this out right now is that to square it off, I have to do this on the belt sander by hand. Unfortunately, I was able to get it squared, and I double-checked it with some tools. However, when it came time for installation, this is where the warpness kind of showed its ugly head a little bit. It's not too much, I could live with it, but if you are working on one of these older sets or something similar to this, this is something that you are going to have to live with, or work with, I should say. Okay, so when it comes time for lining it up, of course, there are no suggestion points whatsoever on the receiver or on the jacket itself. You have to basically just eyeball it. Or you have to use your head. So fortunately, a lot of photographs of these things are out there, so you can go ahead and map it out accordingly. So first, the jacket is not installed to the bottom portion here of the receiver. There's this little gap, as we can see right here. On the Browning system, the barrel is actually beneath the feed area, and so as you can see, it has this type of travel. So that's something to factor in. The second is with the orientation of the yaw. So you want to make sure that the piece is nice and aligned as perfectly straight as possible. To do this, we have this large fastener that we have here. This is really the center point of the jacket itself. So I went ahead and put it onto a square and drew a line across the section right over here, and this gave me a good clear indication on the center point. I did the same thing with the receiver. So when it came time for installing the piece in place, I had to carefully just line it up and make sure that the piece lines up accordingly. So what I was saying before is that the front here is lined up perfectly, but because of the yaw and slight deformation on the jacket itself, on the back section over here, you're going to see that's not exactly square, and this is just true to the piece. If I was to go ahead and make this section even, then the front would have been off. So this is one of those type of things where you have to pick your poison. For this one, I wanted the front to be nice and straight because that's the more relevant location. So the back here can take a slight ding for the team, so to speak. But either way, the piece was installed, and it does look pretty good. This is, again, one of those type of features that is just the way it is when you're working on one of these old school cast resin garage kits from back in the day. Something like this today would probably be verboten, specifically. Well, one today is probably would be all 3D print. Cast resin's kind of going the way of the dodo bird, but either way, something like this, yeah, would not necessarily be acceptable on a current production kit. But we're talking about a 30-plus-year-old kit here, so we could live with that with this old school example. Okay, so with the jacket fitted in place, now let's go over some of the details. The first is the photo etch band that we have right here. The piece is flat, of course, so you have to make it perfectly round, and to do this you wrap it around some kind of a dowel or some other object. And one thing to mention is that on the piece itself there are perforations in the photo etch for clearance of this valve over here, as well as this little device over here. And you have to carefully line the thing up so the pieces fit in place, and they do line up pretty well. Once the piece is joined up here, this is probably the trickiest point because the nature of the metal wants to spring out on you. Once the glue sets, it's then time to do some body work. And the body work is going to be from where this strip over here meets the front. So I put some thick super glue in this section over here, wait for it to thoroughly set, and then just polish it down with some sandpaper, leaving for a smooth appearance. The next thing to mention photo etch-wise is the front sight. The front sight is protected with this little guard that we have here. The guard, of course, is photo etch. The real unit would actually be fastened to the cap here with a slot screw or a rivet type fastener. Those are apps on the model over here, so I carefully drilled these two sections out on the drill press, bent the thing to shape, fastened it, or I should say glued it to this area over here, and then I just drilled out carefully and added two fasteners. With those details in place, it completes the look. Also, something else that's missing on the kit is the actual front sight base itself. This here is something that I fabricated on a couple strips of styrene. I just basically looked at the picture of the real one and cobbled together from there. The piece is really easy to fabricate, just some snips and some changes of shape here or there, and you're good to go. The next thing to talk about is the muzzle itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this thing does have a flash suppressor that came with it, and I was actually in the process of using it. Unfortunately, right at the tail end, as frequently happens, it slipped out of my hand, hit my shoe, and bounced off the lost part yet. Now, before someone goes ahead and feels bad about the part, I'm not exactly stressing it too much because, honestly, the flash suppressor wasn't that great, in my opinion. The biggest problem with the flash suppressor was with the holes in it. And this unit, being a product of its era, the holes were made on the master by hand. Why this is the case, or something to mention, is because if you ever try to drill out a lot of little perforations like that by hand, you're never going to get them lined up perfectly square and true. It's impossible. I've tried it many, many times. Obviously, several other people have tried it. It always looks off. And to the credit of the designer, he did mark, you can see where the faint pencil lines were where the guy marked it, but just with the way you're holding something with a pin vise, it just doesn't really work out. So the holes were at best. Could you have lived with it? Maybe, but since I lost a part, it wasn't really that much of a concern for me. So instead I just went with the traditional muzzle that we have here. This here is just turned out of cast resin. By the way, this is an option with the kit. However, silly me, I misidentified the component and I used it right here for the lock section for the cradle. And actually, to be fair, it does a great job for that. So what I did was I just went on the lathe with some resin stock and I just turned it down to the shape that we have here, cut it off, and then mounted it to the front section of the 1917. The next thing to mention are just little valves, little drainage plugs here and here. These are supplied, and you just glue them onto the two appropriate locations, and you're good to go. The only two things that are left to be added and to this section, this has to be done after it's painting, is the valve, or I should say the connector for the tube, and also there's a small little chain retention piece here that is for the fitting section when it's not in place and just dangles in front of the MG. That's going to be done, of course, after the unit is painted. So that's all there is to that, and I gotta say, even this format here, it just looks killer, don't it? I just love the way these things look. Okay, so I'm just going to temporarily put this guy over here, and let's look at the other two bits of equipment. Starting with the cooling, or the condenser, the condenser tank. The unit itself is pretty much good to go. I do have to drill a small little hole for a chain loop. That's something I'm going to do after I film this, but here goes the little cover cap. The cover cap is nicely detailed. It has the thread sections integrally molded on. The only thing you have to do is add the handle. The handle it slips into this little tube here that's integrally molded on, but it's molded solid, so with a very fine Dremel bit, I have to go in there and carefully drill it out, which I did. The piece of wire here is just floor wire. I just bent it to shape and mounted in the current location, and it's good to go. The chain will, of course, connect to this and dangle on this thing when it's hooked up to the MG. And that's all there is to that. And this brings us to the can. So the ammo can is both great and disappointing at the same time. The piece is a multi-part assembly, as I mentioned before. We saw it on those wafers, so you have to sand them down on the belt sander, which again, like I mentioned before with the cradle, it's something that you have to be on your A game with, because if you accidentally oversand, the piece is going to be screwed up. Also, there are two internal braces. Those I actually turned on the mill. One gives you the bottom plate, the other one gives you this other brace for the inside here. And though they were flat with the milling on the one side. They did have a bend to them just with the way they were casted, so this is something you do have to eke and play out with. However, the pieces do go together pretty well for the most part. There are some seams on the two sections here where the end tabs make contact with the side plates, so this was just taken care of with some thick super glue. Once it dried, I just polished it down with some sandpaper, and with the material that this is, it just polishes down very quickly. On the assembly of the piece, the one thing you have to pay attention to is the bottom portion. The bottom portion was glued in. However, because of the crookedness of the part itself, I had to go ahead and square it off on the mill, which is something that was actually fairly easily done. I just clamped this guy in my vise, and I just milled away the material here to give you the proper recess like you see here. The other details to mention that are kit supplied is the lid. We do have a separate handle with two little hinges over here. The hinges are just made from floor wire. I bent it to shape. Now the handle is glued solid to the piece. It's not functional like it is like on the Dragon. Trying to drill out the material here to make the things functional is just too problematic, so it was easier just to render it in this format. The other thing the kit gives you is several pieces of photo etch to flesh this out. So we have the unit over here for the hinge, as well as the locking clasp. And these are actually decently rendered. You have to carefully take them off of the fret, bend them to shape, and then you could then fit them in place. The hardest part was bending little loops over here for the handle. There's not really a whole lot of material there to fold, but obviously I was actually able to pull it off on one of these units here. The other thing is that there are two little holes integrally found into the PE, and on the real unit these would be riveted in place, so I just drilled out the two little sections and added two little sewing pins to give you the detailing that would be required. This was done for the two hinges, of course. Now, the hatch, or I should say the lid, is not designed to be functional on this piece. It's either an open state. However, you notice I went ahead and rendered it closed. And the reason why I did that is because with the way the rounds are, you have to actually make the belt, and honestly,
ain't nobody got time for that.
It's just, it seems like the juice is just not worth the squeeze. Also, a big reason why I didn't go ahead and try to make it with the ammo belt is, simply put, on the real unit, this would lock into this section over here. Obviously, yeah, it doesn't. So, in order to try to make it fit, I would have to do some heavy modification to the can, and honestly, it's just not worth it in my opinion. So, having the can displayed in the open state is just not really worth it for this. So, I'm just going to have the MG mounted in place. I'm just going to have the can displayed right next to it with the lid closed, and this simplifies things for me a little bit. The other thing to mention are the other little clasp over here on the real ammo can. This latch grabs onto this little metal hook, or I should say this metal wire that we have here, and with this hook over here, it locks it down and it snaps it in the closed position. The little hook here was fabricated out of some sheet metal. I just bent it to shape, glued it to the location, giving you the detailing. One other little bit of detailing that was also added, besides the handles, if you notice they are the same green floor wire that I used before, and these are not kit supplied, was on the side section here of the ammo can. There is another little handle right here. This thing is absent on the kit itself, so I looked at some pictures of these things and I fabricated the piece. The hinge itself is just a piece of sheet metal. I stamped in two little divots to replicate the rivets. I glued a plastic tube, which was kit supplied, to this section over here, and then the wire was bent to shape, and it's actually, I believe, functional once the glues are set. If I go ahead, boop, there you go. So, yeah, that's a little bit extra detail I did add to it, and was absent on the kit original. What's also absent on the kit original are all of the embossed information, which, of course, would be found on these ammo cans. However, back in the day, trying to make these things by hand, I'm pretty sure Verlinden, or whoever made the master, just said, it's a little too much, and he opted out. So, what you see here is what we got. With the model completed, let's go ahead and start with the MG itself. As you can see, it looks quite handsome in its current configuration. The first thing I want to start with is the muzzle section. You get to see what it looks like now fully painted. One thing that I want to mention about the 1917 specifically is that generally when you see a lot of people, when they model the 1917, they like to model the jacket section painted in a olive drab or an olive green coloring. However, from what I understand, this is something that was more or less done in field. However, the unit, when it was originally built, would have had the format that we see here, where the jacket itself would have been Parkerized. However, the end sections were made out of brass. Obviously, these features here are a product of its era, as remember, this thing dates back to literally 1917, where this type of manufacturing and materials would be more commonplace compared to the years that came afterwards. On the very cap section of the unit, you can see that there's no seam present from where the photo etch made contact with the end portion here of the resin casting. There would be absolutely no seams found in these locations over here, so if you are working on one of these units, be sure to go ahead and do some polishing up on those sections. It will improve the model and get rid of any sort of seams that will be unsightly. Also, we get to appreciate now the detailing here on the front sight that I fabricated before, and you get to see the addition here of the chain retained caps. The chain is not the original kit supply one. This is the usual metal chain that I utilize on many of my builds, oddly enough, on my 1/6 scale Browning MG cradles and whatnot. But for this model over here, the chainwork proved to be absolutely perfect. The little screw cap sections are made out of a Bakelite type material, so they are reddish in their coloring. And so for the model over here, I just painted them with a little swipe of Tamiya Hull red. Once the unit was painted, I went ahead and pinned it all together with the chainwork. And as you can see, it really completes the look quite nicely. For the section that we have right here on the bottom portion of the jacket, I went ahead and bent a small little eyelet out of some wire, and this is true to form to the real one, and it really does a great job of giving you that extra detailing, but of course it's necessary because this is where the chain would actually connect. On the chain itself, it's actually one continuous long piece, as you can see, again, just like the real one. And on the bottom portion here of this piece that's dangling around, this here is the bung cap, or I believe that's what it's called. Basically, this is what would be screwed into this section over here when the fitting is not present. For storage use, you would go ahead and disconnect this section over here, and then the hole would be plugged up with this small little fitting. As you can see, the piece would be made out of brass, but also that little bit of more likely a rubber type material. The material is also painted with the Tamiya Hull red, as this is the same color of the other units from the real examples that I was using as reference. We also get to see the muzzle section over here. It came out absolutely perfect, and with the way everything was painted and dry brushed, it really looks the deal quite nicely. On this one, I didn't go ahead and add the little poof of powder fouling. For this one here, I just wanted to leave it in this type of format, but if I ever do another one, I'll most certainly go ahead and add those effects. For the fitting, you can see it's sliding off a little bit. This here is actually the kit supplied one, and I'm going to be circling back to the main tube and the word jacket later on. However, for the purposes that we have here, these are all the kit original parts, including the rubber hose that's used for the piece. And on this note, you can see that I actually made the piece removable. This is just for ease of transport. It does make it much more convenient to go ahead and disconnect the unit to maneuver this thing around as opposed to having it connected, which is, oddly enough, why the piece was removable in the first place. On the resin kit, hopefully I can get this guy into focus over here. You can see that the Verlinden kit has this piece rendered absolutely perfectly, and the only thing you have to do is carefully paint it. And on the real unit, it's actually made out of two types of material. We have brass for the main fitting, however, the little quick connect arms are made out of a white metal or probably a steel, if I was to take a guess. So this was just carefully painted with a paintbrush, and now that everything is in focus, you really get to see just how much extra color pop and detailing it gives the part. It's one of those things where the detailing is just molded in. The only thing you have to do is just know how to paint it. When the piece is on display, you just go ahead and line it up, and I slide it in. You can see that I went ahead and drilled a small little hole right there in the middle of this piece in order to install the wire. Now, what you see here is actually the piece is hollow through and through, and the wire descends from the top portion here all the way into the tube. This was done so that the piece is nice and rigid, and the tube plugs onto the piece, making it much more robust compared to just trying to glue this thing flush to the end of the tube without any sort of support. If you go ahead and do it that way, it's not going to hold up very well, and you're going to be busting this thing off quite frequently. However, if you do what I did and carefully hollow it out and slide the wire in, the wire acts as a nice little backbone, and it gives much more rigidity to the piece, making it again much more robust for just general handling and general display for that matter. When it comes time to display the piece, I just go ahead and just plug this fella in where he needs to go. Obviously, a corresponding hole was drilled into this section over here. It was kit supplied or kit marked, so the only thing I have to do is just drill it out. A couple of seconds with a Dremel later, and as you can see, the piece does the job quite nicely. And and because of the length of the wire, it holds it in mostly very well. If it gets a little loose, I can always add a little drop of super glue to the piece, but honestly, I don't really think that's necessary. Back to the brass fitting that we have over here. The brass is actually the gold leaf paint that I referenced in a few of the other videos, namely my water-cooled 50 cal Browning videos, where, just like this one here, again, it's a product of that era, that Unit 2 also has quite a few brass fittings, and this paint here is probably some of the best gold paint on the market. I absolutely love this stuff. It applies very nicely with a paintbrush, and when it's applied, it's very, very smooth, and it just handles extremely well. The paint can be found in most craft stores. I picked it up, I believe, from Michael's, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm pretty sure you can find this stuff online on Amazon if push comes to shove. Either way, if you are working on a model and you need to have some kind of a brass fitting or a gold type feature, this paint here is definitely one I recommend all day long. While on the topic of the brass, takes us to the rear portion of the jacket, where we get to see the rear portion of the fitting also painted with the same paint. Unlike the one in the front where we have that nice little band that runs across the front area, which gives you a clear delineation and a guide to apply the paint, on the back that's not the case. So I actually had to carefully go ahead and paint this by hand with a very precise paintbrush to make sure that it has the nice little lip that you see here. This would be true to form to the real one. There would be a small little ledge right here where the non-brass jacket would connect to this fitting. And with the piece painted, it just really improves the look and just makes it look very, very sharp. In addition to that, on the 1917, the brass fitting isn't just on the jacket, but it's also really the front trunnion of the piece, more or less. And you can see exactly how that looks when the piece is fully painted. Obviously, this just requires just a little bit of finesse with the paintbrush, but if you play your cards right and you have your skills in a row, you should definitely get some very nice results like I did over here. The brass fittings are painted after all of the remainder of the weathering work is completed. Jumping ahead a little bit, the entire 1917 itself was spray painted with El Cheapo flat black spray paint for the base. Then, to achieve the parkerization look that you see here, this was done with diluted Tamiya NATO black, applied with the airbrush, and then once that dries, gives you that nice chalky grayish look that you see here, which would be very common again on weapons that were parkerized. From there, the unit was then just fully dry brushed to get the worn edge effects that you see that's very common on my weapon builds. And it is at that point there, once all of that work is out of the way, where I went ahead and painted on the brass. This needs to be done at that stage because you don't want to have any of those other effects interrupt the brass painting that needs to be done to the appropriate areas. And as you can see, it's one of those type of procedures where if you line up the orientation correctly, you will have some excellent results. So back to this portion here of the cooling jacket, we have here the other fitting cap right there. Again, it's the same piece as before. I was painted with the exact same methods, and I also went ahead and secured in place with a little length of metal chain, as it would be on the real unit. It's one of these features that makes these water-cooled MGs so cool. It's just all the little brass fittings and the chain work that's there, and everything's dangling. It just makes for a really, really cool type of a detail to have on one of these sets. And this is just not something that you have on standard air-cooled units. Moving backwards on the receiver takes us to the charging handle section, and you can see how the unit is more improved with the type of weathering that you see here. On these 1917s and Brownings in particular, in order to take the bolt carrier group out, the unit does need to be pulled back, and then from here the piece can pop out. Also remember, this is a reciprocating charging handle, so weathering that you see here in this location with the format that you see would be very true to form for a unit that has definitely seen some service. All of the weathering effects were just done with the dry brush method. Moving back further takes to the pistol grip area. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of detailing that went into this section, but now that it's fully painted and weathered, you can see how all that just comes out and makes them all look just that much more polished. For the weathering, this is again the portion of the weapon that gets handled the most with your hand. Generally, when you hold these, you hold it over here and you put your hand on top like that. So these tend to get worn in this type of format and it's again something that would be fairly common. For the weathering, again, all done with the dry brush. When you're dry brushing these weapons, you want to make sure that you have just the right consistency and you don't want to overdo it. A lot of people out there, when they weather these things, they just like to take just silver paint and just slather it on, and that's just definitely something that hurts the look and you're not helping yourself. When you're doing a unit like this, regardless of scale, you want to go into the head of the person who's using it. And again, so how do you hold this thing? Where are the portions that you hold? What's always rubbing up and snagging into things? And when you have, and you think about it in that context, this will really help you start with trying to crack the weathering locations. And when you do that, you'll know how much to apply, where to apply, and the end results will definitely be much more improved as opposed to just haphazardly just slapping everything on. On the reverse side of the receiver, you get to see, again, more of the pistol grip and the trigger area. And you also get to see the feed area here where the ammo belt would be entering into the MG when in use. Obviously, something like this would tend to get worn after some usage. On that note, this brings us to the top cover, and here you get to see the rear sight assembly. Remember, I went ahead and made some modifications of this earlier on in the video, and with everything painted and weathered, again, it just really enhances it compared to the stock offering. And while on that note, the piece again is still fully functional, as you can see. But let me go ahead and readjust the camera so you get to see what the guts look like with the top cover open. Of course, these sections here take to dry brush weathering the way a duck takes to water, and it really does highlight everything, and it makes everything just come out, and it looks fantastic when you go ahead and get the right amount of weathering into the right locations. All those added details that I mentioned before really come out, and it definitely improves the piece over just the stock offering. The stock does give you a pretty good base to work with, and the only thing you have to do is just add a little bit more detailing here and there in order to get the full effect of what the internal detailing looks like on one of these pieces. And with this larger scale over here, it does simplify the fabrication a little bit compared to working in smaller scale, and also it's more appreciated when the unit is fully completed, like you see here. Moving down brings us to the cradle. Here you get to see all of those photo etch sections now fully painted and weathered, and they blend in beautifully with the remainder of the paintwork. Starting with the ammo can holder, as you can see, this is that unit that was soldered together before, and one of the benefits of using photo etch in this scale is that the pieces are to scale thickness and look fantastic in their final form. On the rear portion over here, you get to see the rear locking pin that is, of course, chain retained. The pin and the chain are not kit supplied. Well, the chain originally was, but again, this is the same chain that I referenced before for the front portion. The pin is actually it's a spare pin from my 1/6 scale US AFV fluid filler cap set, left over from the jumbo that I'm currently working on. And the way I designed that set, there are several of these pull pins that are spare. So rather than letting it languish away, it was the perfect bit of detailing to add to this model. This piece here is kit supplied, but it's not really the appropriate geometry. They just want you to use the plastic rod in order to facilitate the pinning, but on the real unit, it would be a pin in this type of format. What's also interesting is that even though this would be the lock pin for the fluid cap on a Sherman, which is much larger compared to the one on a 1917, but remember, this model here being quarter scale is much more larger, so with the way everything turned out, the pin for the fuel cover cap was the perfect substitute, or I should say it was the perfect candidate for the use for the detailing here on the 1917. So it was very advantageous. For the chain, again, the same piece that I mentioned before, I just have to go ahead and fabricate that eyelet that I was referencing earlier, but the eyelet also is not metal. It's actually, again, the 3D printed one from the spare from the ECA set. What's nice about that eyelet is that it has the correct shape to it, the correct size, and it just dropped perfectly onto this piece over here. I didn't really have to do anything. I just drilled a small little hole and just dropped the piece on, giving you the end results that you see. So it was, again, a very advantageous little accessory that I had on hand, and it was most certainly put to good use on this model here. For the paintwork on the tripod, I went ahead and utilized my standard World War II pattern of olive drab. It's my own personal mix. It's an exterior latex house paint that I go ahead, thin out, and apply via the airbrush. And once it's applied, I go ahead and apply the weathering with the various airbrush and dry brushing effects that I've frequently referenced a lot in these videos. However, unlike the other models that are similar to this where I go ahead and throw on the VMS matte varnish to seal them up, on this one here, that wasn't the case, and I didn't varnish it. And the reason has to do with the weathering that we have below on the tripod itself. On the tripod, you should be able to see that the weathering on this is a little bit different compared to the other units that I've built in the past, namely for the 50 cal, and again, just other models that are similar in format. That is because, from looking at a lot of reference pictures of these real units that are floating around online, it appears that the midsection here of the 1970 tripod is actually made out of brass. So weathering this was a little bit different compared to my standard format with the use of dry brushing, where I use flat black to achieve the chipping effects and the worn edging effects on painted subjects like this one here. So for this one, it was still dry brushed, but after the application of the airbrush weathering and also the Tamiya panel line accent, I went ahead and used the dry brush, but instead of silver dry brushing or black dry brushing, it was gold paint. So I took a little bit of gold spray paint, sprayed on some cardboard, and rubbed the fan brush in much along the same lines I do with the other colors, namely the silver, for instance, that you saw on the receiver. And then once the brush was loaded with the silver or the gold spray paint, I then went ahead and dry brushed it onto the surfaces that you see here, giving you for the worn effects that look very much true to form to the real units that I was using as reference. As you can see with the worn edges here with the brass poking through, it really does make the piece look that much more improved and just gives that much more extra color pop and interest to the piece as opposed to just leaving it without any sort of weathering or chipping whatsoever. It's also because of this paint here is why I didn't add the varnish. The VMS matte varnish is my go-to, and this stuff is literally the GOAT. The problem with it is that if you have metallic paint, i.e. the paint for the silver spray paint, or in this case the gold spray paint that's passing off as brass, when you apply the varnish to it, it does something weird to the paint where it still is going to be the same color, but it changes it from making it a lot more dull, which again is the point of matte varnish. However, it tends to change the properties of it, and it takes away some of the visual effect that it has if you just leave it in this type of format. So that's why for this model here, I erred on not varnishing it, and I'm leaving it in just the El Natural state. The need for the varnish isn't really necessary in that regard, and there's no decals on it, so I could definitely pull off without applying it. But if I was to do this again, what I would do is I would first varnish everything and then apply the dry brushing effects. On a similar note, on all of my models, I do not varnish the weapons themselves. So the 50s and the 1919s and 1917s, on all the builds, they are not varnished. I go ahead and add those after the varnishing has already been completed. Continuing along takes us to the ammo can, and here you can see the completed 30 cal ammo can. Nothing really much going on over here that I didn't already reference before, but of course now that the unit is fully painted and weathered, it really does depart quite nicely, specifically with all those extra details that I scratch built and added previously. The only thing that I wish it had was the correct mounting bracket embossings here so that I could slip this guy in place and secure him to the cradle itself, but for this one here, we're just going to leave it in the following format. If I somehow another one of these things ever turn up, well, then I'll be able to go ahead and possibly render it in that format. But nothing much more needs to be said about that, and this brings us to the cooling jacket. So as I mentioned before, the tube is the kit supply tube, and it's excellent. It does the job very, very nicely, and one thing I like about it is that it doesn't need to be weathered. It's literally perfect from the get-go. The only thing you have to do is, like I said before, you have to mount on the fitting, which was done with the wire improvement, and also for the inner portion over here, I went ahead and drilled out the center portion so that the tube can actually plug into. Otherwise, it's too shallow, and this thing is just going to be bouncing around all over the place. So if you drill a nice little deep hole into the solid cast resin condenser itself, the piece as you can just plugs directly in with a drop of glue. Nothing is going anywhere. The last thing to mention is the cover cap. As you can see, the piece is very nicely detailed, and it's one of those things that just wander around all over the place. It's not chain retained or anything, and you have to be careful because you can accidentally break this or loose it with the utmost ease. So it's one of those things you definitely want to pay attention to when you're handling one of these type of units. Same is also true for not just this one, but also the 1/6 scale counterparts as well. When you're painting the piece, you want to make sure you go ahead and paint the threads like I've done over here. Obviously, those wouldn't have any paint on those on the real unit. The last thing I do want to mention now that the condenser has been disconnected is that I also went ahead and painted the stem here for the cradle yoke pintle itself. Just painted with a little bit of silver spray paint with a paintbrush, as these would be left in this type of format on the real unit. And in this angle over here, you get to see the weathering applied to the bottom portion of the 1917 yoke itself. On the yoke, it's only really secured to the cradle with the lock pin in the back. This piece doesn't really secure to anything. I did add a little drop of glue when I was securing it in place, but as you can see, it didn't really hold up all that well, and the piece is fairly loose. So you want to bear that in mind when you're working on one of these units. It really only secures securely to the back section. If I was to do another one, maybe I would go ahead and alter the front trunnion over here, making it, giving it a design that is a bit more improved, will hold it in with a little bit more rigidity. But again, this thing is just going to be a shelf display model. It's not really that important. But it's definitely a data point that I do want to reference. And again, if I ever did a second one, it's probably one of the things I would revise on it. It's a little stiff. You want to be careful because this is cast resin. It's fairly fragile. So when you're manipulating the elevation like I am here, you just want to make sure you're gingerly with it, shall we say. But once the piece, again, goes back together again, and this guy here plugs on, all there, that's all she wrote, and the piece is now ready for a display where no one can go ahead and mess with it. The last thing I want to mention is just how physically large this model really is. This is a really nice size piece, and in order to put things in perspective, generally when I do a weapon or an MG on this channel, it's in 1/6 scale, which for the most part is a huge piece, and it's one that looks very nice and has a decent size to it. However, it's actually quite dwarfed by this example over here. And in order to get an idea on that, here I have off camera on my lap components for a Dragon 1/6 scale Browning M1917 kit, which is going to be the subject matter, of course, of its own model showcase video when that time does come. But here we can see the Dragon counterpart compared with the Verlinden. Most notably, here's the cooling jacket. And if I bring this guy closer, yeah, you can see just how much bigger the cooling jacket is found on the other counterpart. Same thing is also true for the tripod base itself. And you really get to appreciate just how much bigger this thing is when you take a look at the receiver. There's the 1/6 scale Browning 1917 receiver, which is a nice size. Yeah. This thing is just minuscule in comparison. There's the pistol grip right there. Yeah. Overall, a Dragon 1/6 scale counterpart is about like this big and about like this much shorter compared to the Verlinden example. So it does have quite an opposing view to it, and it's a very, very nice piece. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but you know what? Let's just skip across to where I go ahead and go into that with a little bit more depth. In the end, I absolutely loved working on this model over here from start to finish. There's really no other way to put it. This model here was fun on so many levels. One, this subject matter I personally dig. I love these things. And the second thing is that this being an old school resin kit from the 90s definitely takes me back to another era, and it was really fun dusting off a lot of the older fabrication techniques and resin fabrication working techniques that I've had all these years to work and apply to this one over here. And this really accumulated into a really cool, fun, and unique piece. This was definitely a bit of a surreal experience for me to work on because this was one of those models that was always floating around in my periphery. I always remember seeing it in Squadron mail order, and it was one of those things that would always catch my eye, and I would say to myself, wow, that's pretty cool, along with the other quarter scale weapons that he had, like an FG-42 and an FMP-90, and I always thought, wow, those are really interesting, but carry on, and I'd flick the page and move over and land on the stuff and the subject matter that I generally work on more commonly. So having this model in my hands in my collection definitely is one that feels pretty interesting to say the least. This model, of course, is in very good company because I have several other 1/6 scale MG models that are similar to this, namely my water-cooled M2s that I've made several videos on already, can be found on this channel. So this one here is going to be parked next to those ones, and it's going to blend in quite nicely. Albeit, it's a bit bigger compared to those other units, but it's still going to be one that is going to fit very nicely in the collection either way. I also want to give credit where credit is due. Whoever designed the masters of this kit here, being either Francois Verlinden himself, or maybe he had some other people working for him that was working on stuff for him, whoever did the master really did a decent job with designing of the kit itself. The way it blends cast resin with photo etch, it does so quite nicely, and in a way that builds into a nice, decent piece representing a Browning 1917. Obviously, it does leave some room for improvement, but by and large, I was just polishing what the canvas gave me, and as you can see from the final end result, the canvas was actually pretty good. Remember, you have to factor in that this model here is all done the old school and old-fashioned way. No CAD, no 3D printing, none of that. This is old-fashioned, handcrafted craftsmanship at its finest in terms of both the masters but also with the mold making. And I gotta tell you this because I've done this myself for many years. Designing a mount like this is one that is actually very tricky and is one that takes quite a bit of time, specifically when you have to have something that's this intricate and be it a complete mirror image and have it match and blend perfectly with one another. It sounds really simple, but if you ever have to scratch build something, trust me, you'll definitely see exactly how complicated and how much complication it adds to the build when you have to do so. And whoever designed this model over here, specifically the cradle, did an excellent job with making sure the piece was symmetrical and mirrors very well. Again, I am absolutely in love with this piece over here because of just how good the original model was for me to go ahead and really add upon and improve it further. And you may have noticed I just have hearts just gushing out of me on just how much fun and how much enjoyment I got from this piece over here. And that is the perfect point to pivot us into skill level recommendation. And I could definitely say, I'm going to come out and say, this kit is not recommended to most of the people that watch this channel. That sounds hilarious considering how much I enjoyed working on this model. And there's some nuance to this. Basically, if you are an intermediate, a beginner, or an advanced range builder and you're only used to working with injection molded polystyrene kits, stay away from this one over here. You have no business working on this model, just straight up. This here is an all resin kit, and all resin kits do require a certain skill set in order to put together, many of which I went over in this video. And it's funny to point out because many of the skill sets that are just part and parcel to building one of these type of models over here would be completely just lambasted and poo-pooed by most people that build plastic models. But again, it's a different media, and so you have to go ahead and use those techniques in order to achieve good results when working with that media. So because of that, if you're just used to working on plastic model kits from one manufacturer or another, you're going to be outside of your depth with this one over here. This is a kit that's really intended for use for advanced builders, and specifically advanced builders that are used to working with cast resin. If you're used to working with cast resin or garage kits, then this kit here becomes a viable option for you. It's just the nature of the beast. As we saw, in addition to several of the techniques I mentioned in this video, I also have to have a complete equipped machine shop just to build this thing, even with the out-of-the-box components. This included tools like a belt sander, a lathe, a mill, and a drill press for good measure. And the majority of people out there who build models, specifically plastic kits, do not exactly have these in their shop. And on those models, sometimes I've utilized lathes and stuff on builds in the past, but it wasn't exactly something that I had to have. It was more of a, I have the tool and it does the job quite well. However, for this one over here, you really need to have those bits of equipment in order to really get this thing to be built to its full potential. And again, if you are used to working with resin and garage type kits, generally speaking, you have a well-equipped shop in order to undertake such of a build. Now I hear you, and you're saying to yourself, but damn it, John, I really love the Browning 1917. The one that you built here is beautiful. I don't have a machine shop or anything about resin kits, but I know how to build plastic models, and I wanted to do something similar to this. Well, you're not completely out of luck, because again, there is a competitive option, which is the Dragon 1/6 scale plastic kit counterpart. Although that one is a bit smaller than this one here, being 1/6 scale as opposed to 1/4, that one is a traditional plastic model kit and is far easier and conventional to put together compared to this model over here. Unfortunately, that model has been out of production now for some years, but it is something that can be tracked down with relative ease, and when they're found, are fairly affordable. No point loitering on that topic, which brings us to recommendations. Now, bear in mind, the recommendations have an asterisk that you have the prerequisites that I just mentioned in order to put one of these together. Otherwise, it's a moot point. But let's just say you are one of those type of people that have the skill sets and the tools to put this together. Who do I recommend this kit to? Well, this kit I would definitely recommend for anyone who's an avid fan of Browning MGs. If you just love these things, the M2, the 1919, 1917, then this model here becomes something that's going to be highly recommended. This model builds very nicely, and as you can see, has a very nice shelf appeal to it, and will enhance a bookshelf, or even if you are those type of individuals that love the goat guns that are really popular out there, this unit here will definitely add to that collection immensely. I would also recommend this model for anyone who's an avid fan of building and collecting vintage kits, and also vintage resin kits. These models are fairly collectible. Remember, they are out of production and they are long gone. There's no way that this thing, I doubt it very much, is going to be coming back anytime soon, or ever for that matter. So what's out there on the market is out there on the market, and if you have the skill sets again to put one of these together, it would be definitely worth checking out. Interestingly enough, although I would assume that these models here haven't been in production for at least 25 years, a decent number of them must have been produced by Verlinden Productions, because they do tend to pop up from time to time quite frequently on online vendors. eBay, I've seen a number of these pop up from here and there, and also I wouldn't be surprised if you go to a model show or two, a vendor might have one or two stashed away or squirreled away in one of those big boxes that they have a bunch of kits shoved into. Either way, when found, you could probably get one for about 40, maybe 50 bucks, if that. And it's, again, one of those models where if you have the know-how how to put together, they become something quite special. Best way to put it, these are not the kits for everyone, but they are the kit for someone. And if that someone is you, I definitely recommend checking it out. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/4 scale Browning M1917 water-cooled MG. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being model showcase videos like this one over here, or my other type of content being my 1/6 scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have photographs of all of the smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. As well as, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.